Stanley was 25 years old, the eldest son of President Adebayo, the leader of one of the wealthiest African nations. His life was the kind that most people only dreamed about. He had it all: fast cars, private jets, a massive mansion, and a world of power at his fingertip. But none of these could fill the void in his heart. Although many girls flocked to him like bees to honey, it was never for who he was as a person. Stanley had been in several relationships, but all of them ended the same way, with heartbreak. Each girl was after his wealth, not his love. Once they got what they wanted, lavish gifts, expensive vacations, or fat checks, they would leave him, and Stanley was left alone and heartbroken every time. "I want someone who loves me for me, not for my father's money," he said to himself one evening, staring out of the window of his luxurious palace room. He was tired of the fake smiles and shallow conversations. Stanley longed for real love, the kind of love that didn't care about who he was or what he had. He wanted someone who would love him in spite of his wealth, not because of it. One evening, he made up his mind. "I will go somewhere far away where no one knows who I am, where no one knows I'm the president's son. Only then will I find true love." The next morning, Stanley spoke with his parents about his decision. His mother, the First Lady, was stunned. "You want to leave all this behind? How can you possibly live like a poor man when you have everything at your feet?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Stanley looked at his mother and said softly, "Mom, I need to do this. I'm tired of being surrounded by people who only care about money. I want to find someone who sees me, the real me." President Adebayo, his father, sat quietly for a moment, then nodded. "Let him go," he said, surprising everyone. "The boy needs to find his own way." His mother eventually agreed, though reluctantly, and so the plan was set in motion. Stanley packed his bags, but not the designer clothes or the fancy watches. Instead, he put on old, tattered clothes, worn-out shoes, and left his family's wealth behind. He looked like a completely different person, like someone who had seen hard times. He left the capital city and traveled to a faraway town where no one knew him or his family. He chose this place because it was a bustling city with thousands of people. Here, he could disappear among the crowds. Life in this new city was nothing like the one Stanley had known. Instead of sleeping in a grand palace, he slept in a small, rundown shack. He worked the dirtiest jobs just to survive, carrying heavy loads, cleaning dirty streets, and even begging when there was nothing else to do. The people he met treated him poorly. They called him names like lazy dog and smelly pig, and whenever he tried to talk to a girl, she would laugh in his face and shoo him away like a fly. Stanley would lie on the cold floor of his shack at night, thinking about how different his life had become. He had never felt this alone before, but he didn't give up. He knew he was on a mission to find real love. One day, while sitting on the street corner, a young woman walked past. Her name was Susan. She was a princess from a very wealthy royal family, but you wouldn't know it just by looking at her. Susan was different from the other girls. She wasn't flashy or arrogant. She had a heart of gold, and that was what made her stand out. As she passed by Stanley, she noticed how tired and hungry he looked. She stopped, and without a second thought, she walked up to him. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Handing him a loaf of bread and a bottle of water, Stanley looked up, surprised by her kindness. "Thank you," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. From that day on, Susan made it a habit to visit Stanley regularly. Every day, she brought him food, clothes, and even blankets to keep him warm at night. She didn't care that he looked dirty or poor. To her, Stanley was just a person in need, and that was all that mattered. As days turned into weeks, Stanley and Susan began spending more and more time together. They would sit and talk for hours, sharing stories about their lives. What surprised Stanley the most was that Susan never once asked about money or riches. She was the first girl who cared about him without knowing who he really was. Stanley's heart began to soften, and before he knew it, he had fallen in love with her. But he was afraid. What if she found out who he really was? Would she still love him, or would she become like the others? Despite his fears, Stanley couldn't hold back his feelings any longer. One evening, while they sat under a large tree looking up at the stars, Stanley looked into Susan's eyes and said, "I love you." Susan smiled, her eyes twinkling like the stars above them. "I love you too, Stanley," Overjoyed, Stanley felt a sense of peace he had never known before. For the first time in his life, he felt truly loved. But their happiness didn't last long. When Susan told her friends that she was in love with Stanley, they were horrified. "You're a princess," one of her friends said in disbelief. "You can't be with someone like him. He's just a poor beggar." But Susan stood her ground. "I don't care about his status. I love him for who he is, not for what he has." Her friends tried to convince her to leave Stanley, but Susan refused. "If I lose my friends because of love, so be it," she thought. Stanley, unaware of the growing tension in Susan's life, was happier than ever. He had found someone who truly loved him. After weeks of growing closer, he finally mustered the courage to propose. Under that same tree where they had shared their first confession of love, Stanley pulled out a small, simple ring and said, "Susan, will you marry me?" Susan's eyes filled with tears of joy as she whispered, "Yes, Stanley, I will marry you." But when Susan told her parents, the king and queen, about her engagement, they were furious. "How dare you think of marrying a common beggar?" the king thundered. "You are a princess, and you must marry someone of royal blood." The queen added, "You have disgraced this family. You will not marry that man. You are forbidden from seeing him." Susan was heartbroken, but she refused to back down. She loved Stanley with all her heart. Every night, she would sneak out of the palace and go to meet him. Weeks passed, and one day Susan woke up feeling dizzy and weak. Worried, her mother took her to the hospital, where the doctors gave them surprising news. Susan was pregnant. The king and queen were furious when they found out. "Who is the father?" the king demanded. "It's Stanley," Susan replied quietly. The king's face turned red with anger. "That beggar. You will not carry his child. We will have the baby aborted, and Stanley will be punished." But Susan refused. "I will not let you take my baby, and I will not let you hurt Stanley." In the dead of night, Susan escaped from the palace and ran to Stanley's small home. Out of breath, she collapsed into his arms. "They want to kill you and take our baby," she cried. "We need to leave." Without hesitation, Stanley agreed. They packed a small bag and fled the city together. As they traveled through the night, Stanley turned to Susan and said, "There's something you need to know." "What is it?" Susan asked, wiping tears from her eyes. "I'm not just a poor boy," Stanley said quietly. "I'm the first son of a very wealthy president." Susan stared at him in shock. You're the president's son," Stanley nodded. "I left my family's wealth behind to find someone who loved me for who I am, not for my money." Tears filled Susan's eyes again, but this time they were tears of joy. "I love you, Stanley," she said. "Whether you're rich or poor, it doesn't matter. I just want to be with you." When they reached Stanley's family home, Susan was welcomed with open arms. Stanley's parents were thrilled to meet the girl who had loved their son even when she thought he had nothing. A few days later, Stanley's family went to Susan's village to pay her bride price. When the villagers saw Stanley, they couldn't believe their eyes. The poor homeless man they had insulted was actually the son of the president. The king and queen were speechless. They had tried to stop their daughter from marrying Stanley, but now they realized the truth. They accepted Stanley's bride price with humility, and a grand wedding was arranged. People from all over came to witness the marriage of Princess Susan and Stanley, the president's son. And as for the girls who had rejected Stanley before, they were filled with regret. They had missed their chance at true love, blinded by their obsession with wealth. But Stanley didn't care about them anymore. He had found the one person who loved him for who he was, and that was all that mattered. Stanley and Susan lived happily ever after, and their story became one that people would tell for generations to come, a story of true love, bravery, and the power of seeing someone for who they truly are, not for what they have.